The House on the Cliff. Chapter 18. A Startling Discovery. The Hardy Boys were tense with a realization of their peril. The strong electric light that hung from the center of the ceiling cast such a vivid illumination that they were sure they would be seen practically any minute now. When they found that the boxes behind which they were hidden were spaced some distance apart, but for the folds of the silk that hung down over the opening, they would certainly have been seen. "Here's some of that special silk," they heard the first man say. "Perhaps they'd better bring it up, too." Burke was saying he could handle some more silk. "We're done for," thought Frank. "If he ever comes close enough to pick up that silk, he'll see us sure." But the other man objected. "What's the use? You won't get any more thanks for carrying all that stuff upstairs, even if Burke does take it. And if he doesn't, you'll just have to cart it all the way down again. My motto is in this gang is to do just what Snakely tells me and no more." "I guess you're right. We'll just bring up the dope." To the relief of the boys, the man turned away and went back to the other side of the chamber. They could hear a rustling sound. Then came the words, "Well, we've got it. Let's go back up." The switch snapped, and the cavern was steeped in darkness immediately. It was a darkness immeasurably welcome to the lads, crouched behind the boxes. They began to breathe more easily. They heard the door close, and then they could hear the footsteps of the two men as they ascended the stairs in the passageway. When the footsteps could be heard no more, Frank switched on the flashlight with a sigh of relief. "That was a close call, gosh, but I was sure they had us. We wouldn't have had any chance with the pair. You can bet your life they were carrying guns. Well, let's follow them. I'm with you. We know we're on the right track. And we know we're liable to blunder right into the whole den of smugglers if we don't watch our step. It's going to be ticklish from now on. It can't be any more ticklish than it has been. I aged about 10 years while that pair was in here." They crossed the chamber and again opened the door. Cautiously they stepped out on the landing, closed the door behind them, and again confronted the flight of steps. "I'll go first," said Frank. "Stick close behind me." He decided to turn out the flashlight because it was barely possible that the smugglers might have a guard at the top of the stairs, in which event their approach would be discovered. So, in the inky blackness they ascended, step after step. They reached the top of the first flight of stairs, and then they found themselves upon a crude landing of planks, which ran along the side of the rock wall for some distance until it ended in another flight of steps. Here the boys stopped again to listen. All was as silent as a tomb, save for the distant pounding of the sea upon the cliff. "I don't hear a sound," whispered Joe. "Come on," came from his brother. The passage through the rock was considerably deep, and they went on up countless steps until their limbs were weary. They had never realized that the cliff was so high until now. But at length they reached the final landing, and there they were confronted by another door. This door, they assumed, either led out into the open or into some cave just below the surface of the ground. Perhaps, thought Frank, it even led into the cellar of the Palooka house. The boys pressed close to the door, taking care to make no noise, and listened. They heard not a sound. Still, with the caution arising from their previous narrow escape, they decided to wait a little while longer. As later events proved, it was well that they did. For a while they could hear nothing from beyond the door, and there was no indication that any one was there. But after listening intently for as long as 5 minutes, they heard an odd shuffling sound and then a sigh. That was all. "Someone there," breathed Frank in a low whisper. Joe nodded in the darkness. They did not know what to do. It seemed apparent that there was someone beyond the door. Possibly a sentry. If there was only one man, it might be possible to attack him and disarm him, although it was scarcely possible that they could do this without noise and without attracting the attention of the smugglers. The problem was solved for them. A door thudded in the distance. Then there was a muffled murmur of voices, growing in volume, and a trampling of feet. "I tell you this nonsense has gone on far enough. He'll sign, and he'll sign right now, or I'll know the reason why." The boys started, for the voice was none other than the voice of the man who had ordered them out of the cove that afternoon. "That's the stuff, Chief," returned someone. "Make him sign and promise to keep his mouth shut." "If he doesn't, he'll never live to tell about it. That's one thing sure," snapped the first man coldly. There was the sound of a switch being snapped, and then the boys could see a yellow beam of light beneath the door at their feet. From the sound they judged that 3 or 4 men had entered the room beyond. "Well, he's still here," said the man who had been addressed as chief. He strode across the room, and the boys could hear a chair scraping on the board floor. "You'll find that this is an easier place to get into than it is to get out of." A weary voice answered him. The tones were low. The boys could not make out the words. "You're a prisoner here, and you'll be a prisoner here until you die, unless you sign that paper." Again the weary voice spoke, but, as before, the tones were so low that the words were intelligible. "You won't sign, eh? We'll see about that." "Wait till he goes hungry for a few days, and then he'll think differently," put in one of the other men. There was a hoarse laugh from this companion. "Yes, you'll be hungry enough before we're through with you, I can promise you that," said the harsh voice. "Are you going to sign?" "No," they heard the prisoner in the other room answer. Who was this man who was evidently held captive by the smugglers in the underground room? The same thought was in the mind of each boy as he listened to the conversation. "You know too much about us. You've found out too much, and we'll never let you get out of here to use your information. You may as well get that straight. You've read the paper. If you don't sign it, you will starve." The prisoner evidently did not reply. "Give him a taste of that hot rod," suggested one of the smugglers. "No, nothing like that. It's too crude." "I'll give him his chance. He can sign this paper now, or take the consequences." Still there was no reply. "Getting obstinate, are we?" "Won't you even answer me?" The leader of the game was evidently getting angry. Suddenly he shouted out, "Sign this paper, Hardy, or you'll starve, as sure as my name is Snakely." Chapter 19. Captured. The worst fears of the Hardy boys were realized. They had been unable to distinguish clearly the voice of the prisoner until then, for it had been muffled by the intervening door. But all along they had suspected that it was their father. Now they knew, and they knew also that he was a captive of Snakely, the head of the gang of smugglers. Joe gave a perceptible start, but Frank laid a warning hand upon his brother's arm. Now, of all times, there was need for caution. They listened. "I won't sign it," replied Fenton Hardy clearly. Snakely replied, "You heard what I said. Sign or starve." "I'll starve." "You'll think differently in a day or so. You're pretty hungry now, Hardy. But you'll be hungrier later on, and thirsty too. You'll be ready to sell your soul for a drop of water or a bit to eat." "I won't sign." "After all, we're not asking you very much. You've discovered a number of things that we want you to forget about. It won't hurt you to go back to Bayport and say that you couldn't find out anything about us. Nobody knows where you have been." "I found out all I want to know about you, Snakely. I've got enough evidence to send you to the penitentiary for the rest of your life, and I have more than that." "What do you mean, more than that?" "I know enough to have you sent to the electric chair. There was a sudden commotion in the room, and 2 or 3 of the smugglers began talking at once. "You're crazy!" shouted Snakely, but there was a current of uneasiness in his voice. "You're crazy! You don't know anything about me. I know enough to have you sent up for murder. All the more reason why you're not going to get out of here without signing this paper. You can count yourself lucky you have even this chance of getting out alive. By all rights, we should knock you on the head and have you thrown over the cliff into the sea. I won't sign." "Don't be foolish. All we ask you to do is to agree that you won't make use of the information you have. I admit that you've stumbled on some of our secrets, and we can't afford to turn you loose and have the federal agents about our ears in no time. You must trust me very much. What is to prevent me from signing that paper and then going back on my word?" asked Fenton Hardy. "We know you too well, Hardy. We know that if you signed that promise, you would keep it. Exactly. And that's why I won't sign it. I wouldn't be doing my duty if I agreed to any scheme that would protect you." "How about your family? Are you doing your duty to them by being so obstinate?" There was silence for a while, and then Fenton Hardy answered slowly. "They would rather know that I died doing my duty than have me come back to them as a protector of smugglers and criminals." "You have a very high sense of duty," sneered Snakely, "but perhaps you'll think better of it after a while. Are you thirsty?" There was no reply. "Are you hungry?" Still no answer. "You know you are, and you'll be hungrier and thirstier before we are through with you. We'll put food and water on your sight, but you won't be able to reach it. You'll die of thirst and starvation unless you sign that paper." "I'll never sign it." "All right. Come on, men. We'll leave him to himself and give him time to think about it." Footsteps resounded as Snakely and the others began to leave the room, and finally they died away and the door banged. Fenton Hardy was left alone. Joe made a sudden move towards the door, but Frank restrained him. "Not just yet," he cautioned. "They may have left someone to guard him." So the boys waited, listening intently at the door, but there was no further sounds from within the room. At length, satisfied that his father had indeed been left alone, Frank fumbled for the latch of the door. Noiselessly he managed to open it. He pressed in on the door until it was open about an inch. Then he peeped through the hole. He found himself on the threshold of a sort of cellar, a damp and moldy chamber, of about the same size as the storage room in the heart of the cliff, with the difference that whereas the first room was a cave in the rock, this place had been dug out of the earth. It was floored with planks, and a lone electric light cast a yellowy illumination over the scene. There was a crude table and a few chairs, while in one corner stood a small camp bed. On this bed he spied his father. Fenton Hardy was bound hand and foot to the cot, so tightly trussed up that he was unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. He was laying flat on his back, staring up at the moldy ceiling of his prison. On a chair beside the cot was a large sheet of paper, presumably the document the smugglers were asking him to sign. The detective did not hear the door open. As Frank looked at him, he was conscious of a change in the appearance of his father, a change that shocked him extremely. For Fenton Hardy was thin and pale, his cheeks were sunken, and he looked like a man who was famished for want of food. Frank opened the door a little wider and tiptoed into the room. Joe followed quietly. They knew that there was danger of the smugglers returning at any moment. They knew that they must work swiftly and quietly if they were to effect the release of their father. A slight sound attracted Fenton Hardy's attention, and he slowly turned his head. When his gaze rested on the features of the boys, who were stealing across the floor towards him, he almost uttered an exclamation of amazement, but he managed to check the involuntary utterance, although his face lighted up with relief. Quickly the Hardy Boys reached his bedside. Frank drew out his pocket-knife, and without a word, without even a whisper, began to hack at the ropes that bound his father. But the knife was dull and the ropes were heavy. Joe had lost his knife in the water soon after they had left Bayport, and although he searched about the room, he was unable to find one. So he set himself to the laborious business of trying to untie the knots. Every moment was precious. At any second the boys knew they might hear the footsteps of the approaching smugglers. They worked with frantic caution, working against time. Frank hacked at the ropes, but the dull blade seemed to make little progress. Joe fumbled at the obstinate knots until his fingernails were broken, but he could scarcely loosen the strands. Minutes passed slowly and agonizingly. Fenton Hardy could give no assistance. He had to lie there in silence, not daring even to encourage the lads by whispers. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of the two boys, by the scarcely audible sound of the knife against the ropes. At last, the knife cut through one of the ropes, and Fenton Hardy's feet were free. Frank pulled the ropes away, but a loose end fell on the floor with a light sound. Slight as the noise was, it seemed to them almost deafening. In view of the necessity for silence, desperately Frank prepared to set to work to cut through the ropes that bound Fenton Hardy's arms, and even as he reached over with the knife, they heard a sound that sent a thrill of terror through them. It was a heavy footstep beyond the door, through which the smugglers had recently disappeared. Someone was approaching the underground room. Frank strained at the knife, but the ropes were stubborn. The dull blade made little impression at first, but at last the rope began to give, and finally, as Fenton Hardy gave a mighty effort, it snapped, and the detective was free. But the footsteps on the stairs had drawn nearer, and it was followed by others. The smugglers were returning. "Quick!" whispered Frank, as he flung the ropes aside. I can't hurry," gasped out Fenton Hardy. "I've been here too long." He could hardly utter the words. His face showed his exhaustion. "But we've got to hurry, Dad," came excitedly from Frank. "See if you can't make it." I'll do my best," returned his father. "If these fellows come back, let's fight it," put in Joe desperately. "You bet we'll fight," answered Frank in a voice that meant a great deal. Fenton Hardy got to his feet as hastily as he could, but when he stood up on the floor, he reeled, and would have fallen had not Joe grasped his arm. He had been laying bound to the cot for so long that he was so weak from hunger that a fit of dizziness had attacked him. It soon passed, however, and the three hastened towards the door through which the Hardy Boys had entered. But the smugglers were very close now. The Hardys could hear the coarse voices just outside the outer door. There was no chance of escape. Just as the Hardy Boys and their father crossed the threshold, the door on the opposite side of the room was flung open. Frank had a confused glimpse of the dark man Snakely, whom he had seen in the cove that afternoon, with half a dozen rough men crowding behind him. Then he saw Snakely whip a revolver from his pocket. The chief of the smugglers was filled with astonishment, but he did not lose his presence of mind. The weapon was leveled at Frank before he had time to close the door. Snakely did not speak. He pressed the trigger, and the revolver roared. The echoes crowded on one another in that narrow space. The bullet chipped into the wood of the door. Frank ducked. Joe, who was in the lead, flung himself to one side. Fenton Hardy stumbled out onto the landing at the top of the stairs. "Come back!" roared Snakely, plunging across the room. "Come back, or I'll fire again!" As the smugglers drew closer, Frank crouched for a spring, and then leaped directly at Snakely. He struck out at the man's wrist, and the revolver flew out of the rascal's grasp, skidding across the floor into a corner. Then they grappled, and so sudden had been Frank's attack that the smuggler had taken by surprise, and he reeled up against the wall. But his companions rushed to his rescue. Frank was swiftly overpowered and dragged away, while other smugglers with drawn revolvers pursued Joe and Fenton Hardy out on the landing. Being unarmed, they were forced to submit, otherwise they would have been shot without mercy. The struggle was short. The menacing revolver gave the smugglers the upper hand. Within 5 minutes, Fenton Hardy was bound to the cot again, while the Hardy boys were seated, trussed up and unable to move, on 2 chairs nearby. They were captives of the smugglers. Chapter 20. Dire Threats. Snakely, once he had recovered from his first consternation and surprise, was in high humor. "Just in time," he chuckled, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. "Just in time. If we'd been a few minutes later, they'd have been away from us altogether." The Hardy boys were silent. They were sick with disappointment. It had seemed that escape was certain, and then in the twinkling the tables had been turned, and now they were all worse off than they had been before. "What will we do with them, Chief?" asked one of the men. The voice sounded familiar to the boys, and they looked up. Not altogether to their surprise, they saw that the fellow was none other than the redhead, whom they had seen at the Palooka place the day Frank discovered his father's cap. "Do with them?" exclaimed Snakely. "That's quite a problem. That's quite a problem. We have 3 on our hands now, where we only had 1. We have to make 3 people keep their mouths shut instead of only 1. We have 3 people to keep guard over now." "We ought to do what I wanted to do in the first place," declared Red-headed doggedly. "As long as Hardy is alive, he's dangerous." "You mean we should get rid of him?" "Sure, we ought to get rid of him. And get rid of those boys, too." "That's easier said than done," returned Snakely, but with a sinister look at the man on the cot. "I should think you had enough of your conscience already, Snakely," exclaimed Fenton Hardy, "but I suppose you're hardened enough for anything," he added bitterly. He was thinking more of his sons and their possible fate than of himself. "Don't you bother about my conscience," sneered Snakely, but a shadow crossed his face. "What do you know about me, anyhow?" he demanded roughly. "I know all about what happened to Felix Palooka. He had a big treasure hidden in that house on the cliff, and you got it, and then you started to use the place for your smuggling operation." "Oh, shut up!" Snakely snapped. "I'm going to fix you, and those kids of yours, too. Just wait and see." 4 of the smugglers had been whispering among themselves at the back of the room during this talk between the chief smuggler and the detective, and now one of these men stepped forward. "Got a word to say to you, Chief," he began, addressing Snakely. "What is it now?" The chief smuggler's voice was surly. "It's about what's to be done with these 3, and now we have 'em prisoners," returned the man hesitatingly. "Of course your business is your own, and we're not asking any questions about what happened to Felix Palooka, but we're in this game of smuggling, see? We don't stand for anything that's too red-headed." "That's the truth," put in another of the men. "Kinda chicken-hearted," sneered Snakely. "You look out, or I'll fire the lot of you." "No, you won't, Chief," replied the first man who had addressed him. "We've helped in this smuggling, and we're going to have our full share of what's coming to us. We've got another plan about those 3 prisoners," put in a fellow who had not yet spoken. "I think it would work out fine." "What plan?" questioned the chief smuggler briefly. "We've been talking about Lai Chang." "What about him?" "Turn him over to Lai Chang. He's sailing back to China in the morning. Have him put on board that ship." Snakely scratched his head for a moment. Evidently the idea caught his fancy. "Not bad," he muttered. I hadn't thought of Lai Chang. Yes, he'd be able to look after them. He'd see to it that they never returned, and he grinned grimly. He'd probably dump 'em overboard before they got to China at all, declared Redhead smugly. Lai Chang doesn't like to feed passengers if they can be got rid of. So much the better. We won't be responsible. Leave him to Lai Chang, the old villain. He would just like to have 3 men in his power. He'll attend to them. Snakely reached over and picked up the documents from the floor. There it had fallen in the struggle. He glanced at it and then tore it into pieces. We won't need this. You've lost your chance, Hardy. If you had signed it, you would be free and home. But you'll never be free. Not with 3 of you knowing our secret. It's too risky. You'll all be turned over to Lai Chang. He brought in a little cargo this week, and this ship is to sail in the morning. You will go with him. Fenton Hardy was silent. He had resolved not to plead for his own safety. Well, said Snakely, haven't you anything to say? Nothing. Do as you wish with me, but let the boys go. We'll stick with you, Dad, said Frank quickly. We sure will, added Joe. You certainly will, declared Snakely. I'm not going to let one of you have the chance of getting back to Bayport with your story. The chief of the smugglers stood in the center of the room for a while, contemplating his captives with a bitter smile. Then he turned suddenly on his heel. Well, they're safe enough, he said to Redhead. We have the business with Burke to attend to. You two, he said, speaking to 2 of his men, had better go down to the cove and take the rowboat out. Signal to Lai Chang that we need the motorboat sent in at once. The rest of you come and help load Burke's truck. If any nosy policemen come along and find it in the lane, we'd be done for. How about them? Asked Redhead, indicating the prisoners. They're safe enough, but I guess we'd better leave one guard anyhow. Malloy, you stay here and keep watch. Malloy, a surly and truculent fellow in overalls and a rugged sweater, nodded and sat down on a box near the door. This arrangement seemed to satisfy Snakely, and after warning Malloy not to fall asleep on the job and to see to it that the prisoners did not escape, he left the room, followed by Redhead and the other smugglers, with the exception of 2 who left by the other door. Their footsteps could be heard as they went down the flight of stairs leading to the bottom of the cliff. A heavy silence fell over the room after the departure of the smugglers. Malloy crouched gloomily on the box, gazing blankly at the floor. The butt of a revolver projected from his hip pocket. Frank strained against the ropes that bound him to the chair, but the smugglers had done their task well. He could scarcely budge. We're done for, I guess, he heard Joe say. Frank seldom gave up hope, but this time he could see no ray of hope at all. I'm afraid so. Looks as if we'd be with Lai Chang by morning. But we don't want to go to China, Frank. We may never get to China, Joe. Didn't you hear what they said? For all we know, that rascally Chinaman, whoever he is, may heave us overboard when he gets well out in the ocean. You fellows shut up, growled Malloy. Shut up, I tell you, or I'll make it hot for you. And he tapped his revolver suggestively. After that, ominous silence fell between the prisoners. Frank and Joe were downhearted. It looked as if their fate was sealed.